This morning, I am going to read from the 32nd chapter of the book of Genesis. And I'll take a moment to set the scene. Jacob is going to greet his brother Esau, whom he has not seen in over 20 years, and they had a less than good relationship. So he packs up his family, and he sends some of the group with peace offerings to his brother to go ahead first in hopes that he'll be able to calm his brother down and that he won't meet with disaster when he gets there. And then Jacob helps his wives. He did have 2 of them, and his concubines, because he had 2 of those as well, and 11 of his children, and he sends them across the river. But Jacob spends the night on the original side of the river alone. And this story is what happens there. And this story completely interrupts the narrative. It does nothing to further the story of the encounter between Jacob and Esau. It's an interruption, and we'll see that it has elements from lots of other biblical stories showing that these motifs were common and floating around in the culture as part of the literature. And we'll also see that this was inserted here likely with very specific ideological reasons. And so I'll read the text so that we can see what those are. V'yivater Yaakov livado, Jacob was left alone. V'ye'avek ish imo ad alot hashachar, and a man wrestled with him until the daybreak. I want you to pay attention because although it says here that it is a man who wrestles with Jacob, 4 and 6 verses later it will be Elohim. It will be God wrestling with Jacob. The book of Hosea retells this exact story. And there it is an angel who is wrestling with Jacob, which means it's really unclear. But I have a little bit more to say about that. It could be a sign of sloppy editing that lots of stories got combined, but if I had to put forth a theory, I would say that it was originally God with whom Jacob was wrestling, and that somebody wanted to write a story to show that you really could wrestle with God. But somebody else got really nervous about that story, so they said, if I take out the word God and I insert the word man, then it will just be 2 people wrestling, which is not nearly as scary as the notion of a person and a God wrestling. V'yar ki lo yacholo, and this man or God saw that he would not prevail. V'yiga b'chaf Yericho, so he strikes Jacob's hip socket. And although I will translate this as his hip socket, I should say that many scholars have suggested it was actually his genitals, but I will leave that discussion for another time. Right on cue. That was my mom online. Okay, back to Torah. V'teka kaf yerech Yaakov behav ko imo, and Jacob's hip socket was wrenched as he fought with him. V'yomer shalacheni ki Allah hashachar, and this man or God or angel says to him, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." V'yomer lo ashalechecha ki im berachtani. And Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Now that should sound familiar, Jacob asking for a blessing. And it should sound familiar because we read that Torah portion here last year on the High Holy Days. Jacob asked for a blessing that time from his father. Wow, his father Isaac. And when in that scene his father said to him, "Who are you?" he lied and he said that he was Esau. So let's see if he does better this time. I know the answer. V'yomer alav ma shamecha, he says to him, "What is your name?" By the way, it's a purely rhetorical question. He doesn't really care what his name is, but the biblical authors want to be able to give us the answer. V'yomer Yaakov, so he says, "I am Jacob." V'yomer lo Yaakov ye'emer od shimcha, he says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, ki im Yisrael, but it will be Israel." In the Bible, name and character and destiny are very interrelated. And Jacob's name had negative connotations. He got his name Yaakov because he was grabbing onto the ekev, the heel of his brother, as they were fighting in the womb. But now he's going to be shed of that name, and all of its negative connotations, and instead he is going to become Yisrael, the father of a great nation. Ki sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim v'tuchal. So it says that the reason he was named Yisrael is because sarita, it's the same root. He struggled with beings divine and human. And last night I told you that Israel means one who struggles, and it may, but now I'll tell you the whole story. It could also mean, instead of one who struggles with God, God could be the subject. So it could mean that God struggles. If you move the dots around, which you can do because the Bible was not originally written with vocalization, the word could be Yashar El. It's the same letters, and that would be one whom God makes straight or upright, which also makes some sense in this story because Jacob is going to emerge at the end with a limp. So we really don't know what they originally intended. V'yishal Yaakov, and Jacob asked, V'yomer Hagida na shemecha. He says to him, tell me your name. V'yomer lamazeh tishal lishmi. And this man or God says to him, why are you asking my name? That exact conversation happens in the book of Judges. The exact same question is asked when he says, why are you asking my name? And so it shows that conversation was between Manoach and a man or a God or an angel. It's also unclear there. So it shows that this was one of those common elements in the story. But what's even more fascinating about it is if Jacob is indeed wrestling with God and he says, what is your name? I think that's a pretty good indication that the biblical authors were poking fun at a people who have a religion with a God whose name that they do not know and cannot pronounce. It's kind of a ridiculous idea that a religion would create a God with a name that they don't know and can't say, but the Israelites have done that. And this biblical writer is making fun of that by having the character standing with God and saying, what's your name? And the best answer he gets is, why are you asking my name? So still we get no satisfaction to that question. Vayvarecho Tosham, and he blessed him there. V'yikra Yaakov Shem Hamakom Peniel, and he named that place Peniel. Ki ra'iti Elohim panim el panim v'tinatzel nafshi. For I have seen God face to face, and my life was preserved. So that's how the place gets its name, Peniel, because he saw God panim el panim, face to face. It's the same word. And that notion that you could see God face to face and interact with God face to face, we see that expression 6 times in the biblical text, never between two people. It is only between God and a person. And sometimes it's an intimate and loving encounter, and sometimes it's incredibly adversarial. We see that in the book of Exodus in chapter 33, where Moses sees God and they talk face to face, and the text tells us it is as one man speaks to another. But somebody, again, was uncomfortable with that notion that you could see God and speak to God face to face, despite the fact that God is anthropomorphic throughout much of the biblical text. So they actually rewrote the ending of that story in Exodus and added this elaborate scheme in Exodus 33 where Moses cannot see God's face. And so he's in the cleft of a rock, and God passes by with only his back showing, and he uses his hand, talk about anthropomorphic, to shield Moses from seeing him. And we're told there that if Moses had seen God, he would have died. It would have been a fatal encounter. So we see, as I talked about last night, the Bible is not a univocal document. We have these conflicting stories and these writers and redactors really competing to get their story in. And the other thing about this particular story about Jacob's name change is that I don't believe that this originally was intrinsic to the story here. I talked about how it's just part of the literature and elements were floating around. But I also know, because I've read the whole book, and only 3 chapters later, I didn't even have to go very far, Jacob's name changes to Israel. The exact same thing happens to him, but it's in a story that makes a lot more sense. And I mean, it's a theory. I wasn't there when they wrote this, but I suspect that was where Jacob's name change happened in the biblical text in a way that made more sense. And somebody inserted it here because they wanted to write a story to show that you could see God, and not only could you see God, you could struggle with God, and what would happen to you at the end? You would prevail. And so that was an entirely new notion in the history of religion. In a world where humans and gods didn't interact directly, in the ancient Near East, kings were primary, and you could only speak to God through an oracle. But these writers wanted to show us that you could struggle with God, and you could emerge victorious in the end.